Question number 8, Grant Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Justice. Does she stand by the Prime Minister's statement to this House in September on Phase 2 of the anti-money laundering measures that, quote, there will be a bill in the House by the end of the year, end quote? If not, why not?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Amy Adams.
Mr Speaker, that was certainly the government's intention at that time. However, as the Prime Minister also said, there are far-reaching implications for a large number of New Zealanders from these reforms. The time frame that we've been consistently working toward is to have the bill passed by mid-2017, and this hasn't changed. However, introduction of the bill may now occur early next year to ensure that we do what we can to minimise the cost of the reforms to New Zealanders.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
In what way has the process of implementing Phase 2 of the AML changes that would include real estate agents, lawyers and accountants into the regime been accelerated, as she and the Prime Minister promised in May of this year?
The
Mr.
Honourable
Speaker,
Amy Adams.
Well, it hadn't originally been our intention to have the reforms passed by July, middle of next year. Now we want to make sure that the legislation is passed by that time. Previously, it would have been into 2018 before the legislation was intended to be in place.
Supplementary, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
Has she taken papers to Cabinet committees this year that would have seen the legislation introduced this year?
The Honourable Amy
Mr Speaker,
Adams.
I've certainly taken Cabinet papers addressing the reforms, and that made it very clear that we're working to the timeframe of the legislation being passed by middle of next year.
Point of order, Grant Robertson.
My question, Mr Speaker, asked whether the Minister had taken papers to Cabinet Committee about introducing the legislation this year. It was a specific question.
Well,
Order No, I think on this occasion, to the dissatisfaction of Grant Robertson, obviously, the question has been addressed. The Minister then said she had taken Cabinet Committee papers to the Cabinet Committee. I think it's been addressed. Further supplementaries? Question.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
I've ruled on that, Mr Robertson.
This will lead the news.
No, Mr Speaker, that was a very specific question about the introduction of legislation. That was not addressed by the Minister.
Oh, well, but the member may have not heard me. I listened carefully to the answer, and I think on this occasion the question was addressed. Further
Supplementary, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
Has she taken a paper to Cabinet Committee this year that would have proposed introduction of legislation of Phase 2 of AML? Well, you could have answered the question.
Order.
You transferred it.
Order. I'm very likely to rule a question out of order if the member continues like that. The Honourable Amy Adams.
Mr Speaker, the Cabinet Committee that determines introduction is the Legislation Committee. I haven't taken a paper to legislation. I have taken policy papers on the proposal, and that has us on track to continue to be having a legislation in place by the middle of next year.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Order. Order. Supplementary question, Grant Robertson. Order. My patience will run out very quickly with the interjections coming from both sides of the front bench. Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
Is it her intention that the details of property buyers and sellers will be captured under Part 2 of the regime?
The Honourable Amy Adams.
Mr Speaker, we have made it clear that Part 2 of the reforms will extend to lawyers, accountants, real estate agents and high-value goods dealers. Further detail of that will be made apparent when the legislation is made available.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
How can she possibly argue that she's accelerating the work when she's actually still finalising policy work, which is the same position she's been in since 2014? And isn't the only reason that acceleration was even mentioned was to take the heat off John Key during the Panama Papers?
The Honourable Amy Adams.
Mr Speaker, the member is simply wrong. The process has been accelerated so that the legislation will be in force sooner than it otherwise have happened. But I point out to this House that this is a regime that will have considerable compliance costs on ordinary New Zealanders, and on this side of the House we want to ensure that those costs are no more burdensome on average mum and dads than they need to be.
Mr Speaker.
Order. 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 I gave a fairly severe warning, and it applies to the Minister who's at the moment answering questions.
Supplementary question, Mr.
Supplementary
Speaker.
question, Grant Robertson.
In light of her own statement that she's had no pushback from lawyers on phase 2 of the reforms, are the further delays and calls for more discussion documents the result of lobbying by the real estate industry, or just that Stephen Joyce doesn't want to upset his mates in the Corrie Lounge?
The Honourable Amy Adams. Order.
Grant, no, mates.
The Honourable Amy Adams.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I'd suggest to that member he shouldn't take his information from the media. What we are doing is making sure the proposals don't impose costs on New Zealanders any more than is necessary. We are still working to and on course to have the legislation in place by the middle of next year. That hasn't changed, Mr. Robertson.
Order. Order. Question number 9.